for your leadership on this crucial legislation and for calling this hearing today. My dad wrote shortly before his death in 2017 these words: "Democracy and its operating principle, the rule of law, require a ground to stand on, and that ground is the truth." The founders of American democracy were obsessed with giving the American people the means to acquire the truth. Madison said, "A people who mean to be their own governors must arm themselves with the power that knowledge brings." Jefferson identified the central role of the press in preserving democracy. He said, "The only security of all is in a free press." So the First Amendment established a preferred place for freedom of the press, just as it established a preferred place for freedom of speech and freedom of religion. The Supreme Court has held that government can reasonably accommodate religious free exercise and worship, which is why federal law can exempt Native American Indians using peyote for sacramental purposes when it bans it generally. It is why public schools can create exemptions for students and employees who observe religious holidays on official school days while not releasing other students and employees. These laws are not constitutionally necessary, but the courts have found them to be constitutionally permissible as a reasonable accommodation of religious liberty, which occupies a high place in our pantheon of constitutional values. Well, the right of free press occupies a similarly exalted perch in our constitutional hierarchy. In theory, the specific command in the First Amendment that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of press was unnecessary because press freedom was already covered under freedom of speech. But the framers insisted upon protecting the distinctive and indispensable role that the press plays as a free institution in our democratic society. Not everyone can go to congressional hearings. Not everyone can go to state legislative sessions or city or county council meetings late into the night. Not everyone can travel into war zones in Iraq or Afghanistan or Vietnam to determine the reality and the meaning of our foreign policies. Not everyone can personally uncover torture at Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay, or obtain the Pentagon Papers, or break the Watergate scandal, or determine how much oil leaked from the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, or figure out what the President and President Putin talked about in their secret meeting in Helsinki. But as citizens, we are all equally implicated by these events, and we are all equally invested in ascertaining the truth of what is happening in our name as citizens. This is why we need professional journalists and newspapers to get the information for us. The First Amendment protects the free press, but that abstract guarantee means nothing if reporters cannot protect confidential sources and whistleblowers, or if they have to live in fear of criminal prosecution and jail time. When reporters cannot do their jobs, our ability to function as a reflective democracy suffers. The free press is not the enemy of the people. It is the people's best friend, and it is the enemy of tyrants everywhere. Jefferson said, "We're left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government." He said, "I would not hesitate a moment to choose the latter." As in other times of sharp political division, like the period of the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, the press in America is under ferocious attack today. Reporters are berated and castigated daily. Journalists have been arrested, punched, attacked, and even murdered, including in my home state of Maryland, simply for doing their jobs. We cannot afford as a society to have reporters attacked or intimidated or fearful. We cannot have them afraid that they will be thrown into jail just for doing their jobs. Congress must defend actively the free press and the American public's right to know what exactly the government is doing in our name. It's time to pass a federal shield law to protect the press, whose work is essential to democracy. America favors shield laws to protect the media watchdogs. Fully 49 states and the District of Columbia have passed shield laws or adopted some sort of reporter's privilege. What more evidence do we need that the American people want to see a free and aggressive press to expose corruption and safeguard the workings of democracy? Mr. Chairman, you and I introduced the Free Flow of Information Act of 2017 last November after Attorney General Sessions, in testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, refused to commit not to jail journalists for doing their jobs. I approached you on the spot and asked you whether you would introduce this measure with me, and I will never forget your immediate and enthusiastic response. It has given me hope that we can indeed come together as citizens and lovers of the Constitution across party lines to defend the basic institutions of our democracy. Throughout our history, dozens of journalists have served or been threatened with jail time for protecting their sources. One of these journalists I know quite well, Brian Karam, who is one of my constituents and the current Montgomery County Sentinel executive editor. In 1990 and 1991, Brian went to jail 4 different times to protect confidential sources while working as a TV reporter. The last time he went to jail for nearly 2 weeks while the Supreme Court considered his case and was only spared a long sentence when his confidential source, once she had moved from Texas to California and no longer feared for her life, came forward and revealed her own identity. Confidential sources like this are essential not only in investigative journalism, whether these sources shed light on government abuse and corruption, as was the case with Watergate, the Pentagon Papers, or the abuse of detainees at Abu Ghraib in Iraq, but also in routine news gathering and the daily reporting of local news stories that immediately and directly influence the lives of our people. The Free Flow of Information Act is long overdue, but there could be no better time to pass it than now, a time of peril to the Republic, a time of corruption when foreign governments are trying to subvert our elections and when the basic values of society are in danger. Mr. Chairman, this exact same federal shield legislation passed the House with overwhelming bipartisan support in 2007, and the bill was championed by none other than then Congressman, now Vice President, Mike Pence. It provides covered reporters with a qualified privilege and contains exceptions for compelled disclosure of a source whenever national security is threatened or when there is a threat of imminent bodily harm or death, and in other discrete and limited situations. It would not cover reporters who are suspected of committing a crime themselves, nor would it give reporters the right to interfere with law enforcement working to solve a crime. This is an area, I think, where we can all come together across party lines to defend the basic pillars of American democracy. I agree very strongly with Vice President Pence, who said it's not a Democratic or Republican issue, it's an issue for all Americans, and I urge my colleagues to support it. Mr. Chairman, I yield back, and I thank you again for your leadership.
You bet. It looks like